So let's get started. Welcome in, everyone. I'm Susan. I'm a co-founder of the U of T Trash Team and program lead for volunteer engagement and community programs. We're excited to introduce our final webinar as part of our larger series, looking at a selection of our pollution prevention projects. Over the course of this series, we've covered the 4 topics you see here, and today we're continuing with our final discussion on construction foam. We'll share more details on how to catch up on all of our webinars at the end of today's talk. First, it's important to take a moment and recognize the lands on which we are gathering today. We acknowledge the diverse and unique groups of Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and in our local work, we acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and it is now home to many diverse First Nations. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the William Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. We encourage you to take a deeper look at the traditional territory you work with, and we have a fantastic starting point which we've shared with you, which is nativeland.ca. And we're sure you're all keen to get started. And before we do, we'd love to learn a little bit more about you and what motivated you to join today's webinar. Please type your responses using the chat, answering either or both of the questions here, including who you're representing today and what brought you to today's webinar. So we'll just give a moment or two for everyone to share and have a look through what people are sharing. And it looks like we do have a great representation of individuals joining us from all over, including Canada and the US. And we're looking forward to be able to hear from some of your questions once we get to that portion. Great. So thanks so much, everyone, for sharing. And we're so happy to have you all here. Before we introduce today's topic more closely, we'd love to briefly introduce our organization to contextualize this important research. The U of T Trash Team was formed in 2017 in collaboration with the Rockman Lab at the University of Toronto. We are a science-based community outreach organization with a shared goal to increase waste literacy as a way to reduce plastic pollution. And we do this work supported by a dynamic team of volunteers, students, and early career researchers, and they are led by our core staff members, which highlight our main work stream, solutions-based research, community outreach, and education. Myself, Chelsea, and Rafaela lead our solutions-based research, community outreach, and social science and education programming, respectively. And Hannah works alongside our organization and OSHA Conservancy to manage the International Trash Trap Network. And through all the work that we do, scientific evidence provides the foundation for our work. Within our solutions based research, we focus both upstream and downstream. Upstream referring to those sources of pollution, whereas downstream targets those items once they've become pollution. And we use those downstream solutions, which here in Toronto includes our trash traps along the Toronto waterfront. And these traps help us monitor the different types of plastic pollution we're finding in Lake Ontario. This data is then used to inform our upstream work, otherwise known as our pollution prevention projects, and each project aimed at preventing different plastic sources from becoming pollution. And today we are talking about one of these items we've been finding downstream, construction foam. Ella, who's an undergraduate student and researcher for the second phase of In Pursuit of Polystyrene, will be joining us today. And before we continue and bring her on, we do want to thank and acknowledge that this research has been carried out in collaboration and support from both the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, as well as partners in Project Green through Toronto Region Conservation Authority, and we thank both of them very much for all of their support. So bringing back to today's webinar, Ella is going to begin with a short presentation with more background on the issue of foam insulation and other materials leaking from construction sites into local ecosystems. She'll also be sharing findings and updates from our current research through this pollution prevention project. We'll then make some time for audience questions for Ella before we then move on to be joined by Chelsea Rockman to lead today's panel discussion, taking a closer look at the issue with a panel of experts. For the panel today, we're very pleased to be joined by Gary with the City of Toronto, Caitlin from Unity Health, and Teresa of Habitable. And you'll get a chance to meet more of them closely when we bring Chelsea on to guide this conversation. And then we'll bring Ella on very shortly. I just wanted to share how questions will work today. As mentioned, we'll have a chance to ask questions after both Ella's presentation as well as the panel. For both of these, you can type questions directly into the chat. And of course, if you prefer to ask them out loud, you can use the raise hand feature during our Q&A portion, and we'll let you know when it's your turn to unmute the microphone. And throughout the webinar, of course, if you have any questions, you can continue to use the chat to ask those. We'll do our best to keep track of them and answering directly if able. It is now my pleasure to turn things over to Ella to share more about In Pursuit of Polystyrene. So welcome, Ella. So let's get started. Welcome in, everyone. I'm Susan. I'm a co-founder of the U of T Trash Team and program lead for volunteer engagement and community programs. We're excited to introduce our final webinar as part of our larger series, looking at a selection of our pollution prevention projects. Over the course of this series, we've covered the 4 topics you see here, and today we're continuing with our final discussion on construction foam. We'll share more details on how to catch up on all of our webinars at the end of today's talk. First, it's important to take a moment and recognize the lands on which we are gathering today. We acknowledge the diverse and unique groups of Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and in our local work, we acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and it is now home to many diverse First Nations. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the William Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. We encourage you to take a deeper look at the traditional territory you work with, and we have a fantastic starting point which we've shared with you, which is nativeland.ca. And we're sure you're all keen to get started. And before we do, we'd love to learn a little bit more about you and what motivated you to join today's webinar. Please type your responses using the chat, answering either or both of the questions here, including who you're representing today and what brought you to today's webinar. So we'll just give a moment or two for everyone to share and have a look through what people are sharing. And it looks like we do have a great representation of individuals joining us from all over, including Canada and the US. And we're looking forward to be able to hear from some of your questions once we get to that portion. Great. So thanks so much, everyone, for sharing. And we're so happy to have you all here. Before we introduce today's topic more closely, we'd love to briefly introduce our organization to contextualize this important research. The U of T Trash Team was formed in 2017 in collaboration with the Rockman Lab at the University of Toronto. We are a science-based community outreach organization with a shared goal to increase waste literacy as a way to reduce plastic pollution. And we do this work supported by a dynamic team of volunteers, students, and early career researchers, and they are led by our core staff members, which highlight our main work streams: solutions-based research, community outreach, and education. Myself, Chelsea, and Rafaela lead our solutions-based research, community outreach, and social science and education programming, respectively. And Hannah works alongside our organization and OSHA Conservancy to manage the International Trash Trap Network. And through all the work that we do, scientific evidence provides the foundation for our work. Within our solutions-based research, we focus both upstream and downstream. Upstream referring to those sources of pollution, whereas downstream targets those items once they've become pollution. And we use those downstream solutions, which here in Toronto includes our trash traps along the Toronto waterfront. And these traps help us monitor the different types of plastic pollution we're finding in Lake Ontario. This data is then used to inform our upstream work, otherwise known as our pollution prevention projects, and each project aimed at preventing different plastic sources from becoming pollution. And today we are talking about one of these items we've been finding downstream, construction foam. Ella, who's an undergraduate student and researcher for the second phase of In Pursuit of Polystyrene, will be joining us today. And before we continue and bring her on, we do want to thank and acknowledge that this research has been carried out in collaboration and support from both the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, as well as partners in Project Green through Toronto Region Conservation Authority, and we thank both of them very much for all of their support. So bringing back to today's webinar, Ella is going to begin with a short presentation with more background on the issue of foam insulation and other materials leaking from construction sites into local ecosystems. She'll also be sharing findings and updates from our current research through this pollution prevention project. We'll then make some time for audience questions for Ella before we then move on to be joined by Chelsea Rockman to lead today's panel discussion, taking a closer look at the issue with a panel of experts. For the panel today, we're very pleased to be joined by Gary with the City of Toronto, Caitlin from Unity Health, and Teresa of Habitable. And you'll get a chance to meet more of them closely when we bring Chelsea on to guide this conversation. And then we'll bring Ella on very shortly. I just wanted to share how questions will work today. As mentioned, we'll have a chance to ask questions after both Ella's presentation as well as the panel. For both of these, you can type questions directly into the chat. And of course, if you prefer to ask them out loud, you can use the raise hand feature during our Q&A portion, and we'll let you know when it's your turn to unmute the microphone. And throughout the webinar, of course, if you have any questions, you can continue to use the chat to ask those. We'll do our best to keep track of them and answering directly if able. It is now my pleasure to turn things over to Ella to share more about In Pursuit of Polystyrene. So welcome, Ella.
Thank you all so much for joining today. I'm really excited to share some background on our progress so far with this project. And so as Susan mentioned, this pollution prevention project is one of several in progress with the U of T trash team. This one going by the name of In Pursuit of Polystyrene. So this project has so far been divided into two phases. The first beginning with work by Gloria Gao, and where she first aimed to identify the source of foam that's reaching our local waterways. Then to determine how much of this foam was sourced specifically from construction activity. So the results of her work, which we'll discuss later, led to my role in phase 2, where we're aiming to increase our understanding of plastic use in construction activity to inform solutions for reducing plastic litter sourced from the construction industry. So this project began with a strict focus on foam pollution because of the data shown on the screen here. So the UT trash team does litter cleanups along the Toronto Harbourfront, and these values that you see have come from the 2023 data summary. So over 50% of the small items collected in 2023 were foam. And in the same year, foam was the 5th most collected large item. This data encouraged further research into where all this foam was coming from, which is where Gloria came in. So to detail phase 1 a bit more, Gloria's methods primarily entailed using a collection of various foams from a range of sources and analyzing them for the content of bromines. So bromines are often used as a flame retardant, so they're frequently found in construction materials like insulation foams. She found that visual characteristics and bromines could be used as a key for what foam pieces were certainly sourced from construction activities and others which were not. So using this visual key and the analyses of bromines, she was able to determine which foams in the environment were likely coming from construction activities. So using these methods, she found the results that you see on the screen. So firstly, that over 50% of the macro-sized foam found on beaches was sourced from construction, and over 50% of the micro-sized foam from surface waters was sourced from construction. So this is where phase 2 comes in, where our initial intent was aiming to measure leakage of materials directly from construction sites and to assess some feasible solutions to reduce the leakage of debris from construction activities. We broke this down into 3 concrete steps, first being measuring leakage, then conducting interviews, and lastly, piloting solutions. So beginning with measuring leakage, our methods were to measure 2 transects of 150 meters squared each along the edge of active construction sites, and then to count and characterize all of the pollutants we found that appeared to be sourced from construction activity. So this characterization was again based on visual cues, and given a bit of experience working in construction, of course with a variety of building materials, I did have some prior knowledge on this identification. And we repeated this method across 8 different construction sites in Toronto. To which we found the following data, where our top 3 items were foam, other plastics, and metals. The main types of foam we were finding were spray foam insulation, foam board insulation, and packaging foams. And on average, we were finding 94 pieces of litter per site, and supporting what we expected to see, foam comprised 42% of all of our findings. So now to discuss the interviews. We've completed 5 so far. We have 3 to 5 in progress, which is all working towards our goal of about 10 interviews. Our main objectives going into these interviews were to gain an understanding of the current knowledge of the issue from people within the industry. We wanted to learn about what materials are used and how they might be escaping from sites to become pollutants, and to hear opinions about the feasibility of these proposed solutions. So I want to cover 3 main takeaways from the interview so far. First, beginning with some points on familiarity with plastic pollution. So the chart on the left shows familiarity with the general issue of plastic pollution, to which there were 3 individuals who felt very familiar with the issue and 2 responding with somewhat. On the right is a chart showing familiarity with plastic pollution, specifically from construction activity, to which we had mixed responses, 2 feeling very familiar, 1 moderately, and then 2 not at all familiar. So before moving on, these are the potential solutions that we discussed during interviews for the pilot portion of our project. So on the left are litter traps, which are catch basins that would be inserted into sewer drains around active construction sites. Then we have covered disposal, which involves covering up disposal with mesh coverings whenever disposal bins aren't in active use. Improved tools consists of potentially smooth blades instead of jagged blades for cutting foam, or vacuum attachments on rasping tools, and we have improved fencing around active sites. So these are some key points that we took away from our discussions on the feasibility of these proposed solutions. So firstly, litter traps were the most widely accepted of the proposed solutions, which was followed by improved fencing. A couple key points were that the solutions are dependent on the willingness of workers to maintain them and to implement them correctly. And cost and maintenance are the 2 most frequent concerns around the solutions. And then some key conclusions regarding the interviews as a whole is that there is a general awareness of the issue of plastic pollution amongst individuals, but responses were mixed regarding their knowledge of construction specifically as a source of this pollution. I did find that knowledge of concrete dust, hazardous waste, contaminated water, however, were high in comparison to other forms of plastic pollution or other forms of pollution around sites. I commonly heard that wind and rainfall were felt to be common pathways for pollutants to escape from sites. And again, project efficiency and completion are the priorities, so solutions must be considerate of how they're going to impact this. So moving into our next steps is the pilot phase of the project, where we have 3 main objectives: to collaborate with 1 to 3 building or construction companies to pilot 1 or several of the proposed solutions. We hope to quantify the effectiveness of the trial solutions, and then to compile a policy brief proposing a range of solutions based on pilot results, our transect data, and literature review. So the proposed solutions for the pilot phase of the project is the 4 which we discussed, and then we're also looking at 2 others which weren't discussed during the interviews, which include on-site environmental supervision and environmental training. So just to summarize everything that we've kind of covered throughout this presentation, phase 1 data tells us that over 50% of the foam found on Toronto's beaches and in Toronto's harbors and bays in Lake Ontario is sourced from construction activities. The data collected from our transects supports The conclusion, as we saw a significant amount of pollution escaping from construction sites, and over 40% of our findings in this phase were foam. We received mixed responses on knowledge of the issue of plastic and other litter pollution sourced from construction activities. But those who felt they had little understanding were very interested to learn more and expand on sustainability initiatives to improve on the issue. So our next step is going to be to pilot solutions that were best supported in our interviews in order to inform greater mitigation of plastic and specifically foam pollution, limiting construction as a source. And thank you.
And so the way that the Q&A will work is that you can either type a question into the chat and I'll be watching the chat, or you can raise your hand and we will invite you to unmute your mic and ask your question directly. And so we'll give people some time to think of their questions and ask questions. And Ella, while they're writing, I'll ask you the first question, and that is, so I know you had prior work in construction coming in, and I'm just curious, if you had been interviewed before starting with the U of T trash team, how might you have answered some of the questions about kind of your perception or knowledge of plastic pollution in general and how it maybe relates to that industry?
I definitely had some opinions prior going into the interview, so it's definitely interesting seeing the range of responses, and I'm excited to keep moving on with those. I think that one of the main takeaways that we talked about being that productivity of the project is really the main importance, the main focus was something that I definitely expected, just given having a little bit of experience in the area. And just knowing the type of people that are in this industry, like they want to get their work done, of course, and efficiently. And so that's definitely something that we naturally have to consider when implementing these processes.
And given your experience before, were you surprised, I guess, in terms of what you found when we did the leakage transects? Yeah,
I think so. I mean, my experience comes from more residential type construction work. So it's a very different world that we're kind of looking at now with the high rises and such, where I think there is a higher risk, at least it seems to me, of leakage because we have high rise buildings and less containments around those sites. So it was really surprising. I know when we first had a look at what we were finding around construction sites, there's not much at first glance, but the more you look into it, even just digging through the grasses and along the curbs, there's so much that you just don't see without looking further, which was really shocking.
Yeah. Well, I would agree. Even I was surprised on that first day. We had obviously seen the foam in the Toronto waterfront from before Gloria's work, which led us to do the project with Gloria. But even I, that day that we walked into the first transect, was surprised. Okay, you have a first question in the chat, and this is coming from Eden. And Eden asks, why do you think litter traps were the #1 preferred solution?
I think that litter traps are almost the most simple solution, I think. And also, prior to even like any introduction in litter traps, right now what's used in construction is typically, I think there are some types of catch basins that kind of less developed than the litter traps, I think, that are inserted into the sewer drains. In some cases, although in most cases there's just a liner that goes underneath the sewer drains. That's just flat across the top. So I think there is almost some people are familiar with the idea, which kind of gives me the impression that it feels like an easier transition into something like this, where maintenance is already required to maintain these cloths, and maintenance would be required for the litter traps, and so there's not a drastic change in implementing them.
The next question is from Elizabeth, and she says, "Hi, Ella. Ooh, come on up. Did you discuss the anticipated time required to maintain each proposed solution with the interviewees?"
Like how much
time and effort they may have had to put in. I think the question is like, maybe how much did that weigh into some of their answers, maybe?
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I definitely think that that's a big consideration is um, because as I mentioned, I mean, prioritization of getting the project done efficiently is very important. And so I think like the litter traps, they do require maintenance, but not constant. And so this is definitely, um, yeah, went into the responses of the interviewees. Um, yeah, it was definitely like of high consideration when I was talking to everyone.
Yeah. Good. Okay, you have a question from Rafaela, which is, were you surprised by any of the results of your research?
Yeah, absolutely. I think every step of the way I was surprised. Every time that I went out and collected data, there was something new coming in. I was learning so much every time I went out. Um, I think that one of the biggest things I learned is how the impacts of wind and water like
Mm,
could drastically change my findings. Some days I'd go and there'd be so much foam on site, and it would be the majority, like the vast majority of my findings for that day. Other days there would be almost nothing, and the majority of what I was finding might have been metals, screws, and bolts, and blades and such. Um, and I really felt that that was not just reflective of the sites we were looking at, but of recent weather, um, or how long it had been since that specific phase of construction was in progress.
mm, yeah, interesting. Question from Katie. Will you look at any cleanup methods to address foam once it's already on the ground? Obviously, prevention is ideal, but we often catch it after it happens and require construction sites to clean it up.
Mhm. That is something we talked about throughout the interviews. Is that um, I mean, I think cleanup is required constantly, but the measure to which that is effectively done, I think, is kind of the main issue that we tend to see. So I think it's kind of something that is already like implemented, but that isn't necessarily done effectively. And so I think that's something that the more that I um, talk to people in the industry and the more we learn, we'll kind of get an idea of what we can do about that further.
Mhm. It's kind of related to your next question, which is a comment from Martha, which says, it would be almost impossible to improve pollution issues with home renovations because there are so many small businesses involved and there must be huge likelihood of a lot of pollution. So this kind of comes back to that idea that is similar to when we had our first pollution prevention webinar was on single-use foodware in restaurants. And you have so many small and large businesses. And so it's this question of how do you change behavior on such a large scale and make this kind of the new normal? I don't know if you want to comment on that at all.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, being involved with the trash team and with this project has been a really like eye-opening experience for me, and that this kind of work can have impacts on big scales. And hopefully, the development of a policy brief and the data we've collected will be able to be impactful. Um, but it's true, and I mean, a lot of the companies that we're working with are like the bigger companies in Toronto, and there is so many like residential scale companies and whatnot that I guess aren't being looked at as much. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's
And
been
you
interesting.
we do have to start somewhere, which
Yeah.
kind of relates to this next question from Teresa, who's one of our panelists, who says, do you know the percent of pollution prevention efforts currently focusing on packaging versus construction materials? So this question of how much focus is going towards construction materials right now in the plastic pollution world. And you can take this one first. I can answer it second because I also have an opinion or a thought.
Okay. Well, one thing that comes to mind is that something that commonly came up um, in our interviews was um, like regulations on um, packaging. I know that in some cases, packaging is expected to be taken back to warehouses when it's at the site. So I know that gives me kind of the idea that um, there is focus on construction packaging, but materials in themselves, I know. I mean, we've found very little literature to kind of support our research. It's very new. Did you want to add, Chelsea?
Yeah, and I think that's good because I think you answered the question directly that Teresa was asking. And the way I first interpreted it when I read it was thinking about because when we started, we were looking at foam and trying to figure out whether it was from packaging or from construction, like being the
Yeah.
insulation foam boards and other foams used in construction. And we ended up finding that more than half of it seemed to be from construction. And there are policies on packaging, in fact, on styrofoam specifically in Canada right now. But to the best of my knowledge, there isn't really a big focus on construction. And this could be from the material side or the leakage side. And I think that, there's a lot of different sources of plastic pollution, and a lot of the policy focuses on prevention upstream by making different materials. And I think very few are focused on kind of the leakage of these materials in use. So,
Yeah.
so hopefully over time, with more awareness of this issue, things will change. We have one question from Alec that we can answer quickly, and then we'll go ahead and start our panel. And this, Alec asks, I'm curious to know whether other types of foam, e.g. EPE, EPP, are found during the studies as well, and whether they are considered insignificant compared to the expanded polystyrene ones. So
I think that sounds like a good question for you, given your
for me,
experience.
okay, but I think the answer is yes. So I mean, I think we did start thinking. I think we even named this project In Pursuit of Polystyrene. But I think a lot of the construction foams that we find are polyurethane foam and other types of foam. So our studies have actually, in the first phase, was foam inclusive, all kinds of foams. And then in the second phase, we've ended up even looking at other things. Ella mentioned nails and boards and other items she found. So the answer, Alec, is yes, we do see them, and they're not insignificant to this issue of foam. Okay, so Ella, thank you so much. You can go ahead and turn your camera off. And if I can invite the panelists to turn their camera on and come on the screen, I will go ahead and share my screen again, and we will get started. Okay, can everyone see my screen again? As well as the panelists. Actually, I can't see who's spotlighted. So can someone just give me a yes if we're all on screen? Oh, we are. Perfect. I can see it. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so we will go ahead and get started in terms of the panel. So the plan for the second half of this webinar is to introduce our panel of experts that have been working on the issue of sustainability from construction from different stakeholder groups for quite some time. And I think you'll find that some of them have been thinking about the types of issues that we're thinking about specifically, which started with plastic pollution, but thinking about other materials. And some of their focus has also been on other types of issues relevant to construction that the reality is are also relevant. So I will start by just doing a brief introduction to our three panelists. I'll remind you how to do the Q&A right after, and then we'll get going. I'll start with a series of questions for each of the panelists. I'll have them introduce themselves as we answer those questions, and then we'll turn it back to everyone in the audience to engage more with more questions that can also be for Ella as well, but mostly relevant to the panelists. So three panelists that you see here on the screen. The first one is Gary Stinson, who works for the City of Toronto. He's been in the city for 30 years, predominantly working in divisions related to storm and sanitary discharge and treatment, as well as watercourse and lakefront studies, so very relevant. He's currently a supervisor with Toronto Water in the Environment Monitoring and Protection Unit. And this is a compliance and enforcement branch, which utilizes various programs, including educational methods, as well as enforcement tools, to ensure industrial, commercial, and institutional facilities remain in compliance with sewer bylaws and water supply bylaws. Our second panelist is Caitlin Points, who's the director of the project engineering and energy team at Unity Health Toronto. Caitlin started the energy team at Unity Health in 2019 and won the 2021 Energy Manager of the Year award from Save On Energy, and actually won it 3 years in a row. And she's currently developing and building the sustainable strategy and greenhouse gas emissions roadmap for Unity Health. And last but not least, I'll introduce Teresa McGrath, who is the Chief Research Officer at Habitable. She brings her background as a chemist as well as a toxicologist to lead a research team of engineers, chemists, and public health experts with a focus specifically on human and environmental health through product life cycles. So her team generates simple, actionable building product guidance, and I recommend you to have a look, and I think she'll put some of those links in the chat, to globally scale the selection of safer options for construction. So thanks each of you for being here. Just a quick reminder really quick before I stop sharing my screen of how you'll ask questions when we get to that part of the webinar. But for now, we'll start with me asking some questions and asking each of you to introduce yourself. So I'm going to start with the first question, and when each of you answer, I want you to introduce yourself because I think it makes sense to do them both in the same question. So my first question for each of you, and I'll go in the order for now that I had it on the slides, and then we'll switch it up later, is what does your organization or sector currently do relevant to the issue of leakage of debris from construction sites? This can be plastic, but it can also be other things. And so basically, who are you? What is your expertise? And how is it relevant to this issue? So Gary, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Chelsea. So I am a supervisor with the City of Toronto and Toronto Water, the Environmental Monitoring Protection Branch. As Chelsea said, we are an enforcement compliance group. We also have a certain amount of policy work, and we have some educational aspects to it also. There's two major bylaws that we operate with: 681, that's the sewers bylaw; 851, that's the water supply bylaw. Our interaction with this is really the reactive side. I mean, there's a proactive side of lot level control, site control, packaging, and all that legislation. And then we're the ones that show up when it's gone bad, when we're finding some type of contaminant. I can say that, for the most part, anything that, and the first point of entry would be a catch basin. In our point of view, it enters our sewer systems via catch basin. We have over 120,000 catch basins in the City of Toronto, so that's ample opportunity. They do have GOS traps, which should keep floatables at the top. We do have routine scheduling and maintenance, meaning we, as you've seen, sweep streets and vector out catch basins, but obviously it's a very resource intensive operation. When we are notified in one way or another of some type of contaminant other than stormwater and waste or snow melt in a catch basin, we would look upon it as a spill. Actually, according to the bylaw, that would be a spill. So we would attend on site. There'd be an educational component. There'd be a spill report that the property owner, in most cases, would have to fill out. At that point, we would most likely look for compliance as opposed to prosecution. If this was an ongoing and apparently, I'm looking for the right terms legally, but if this is ongoing and essentially ignoring the orders from the city, then we might move into a prosecution sense. The city also has a program called the Wet Weather Flow Master Plan. I don't know if anyone's aware of it. It's a 25-year, $1.4 billion plan approved by council in 2023. And it has a portion of it is end of pipe controls, as they refer to it. So any debris or contaminants that are entering the storm sewer system at times do have opportunity to go to a stormwater pond or a constructed wetland. Those facilities are cleaned out on maintenance basis, routine maintenance basis, and floatables are removed. And the Wet Weather Flow Master Plan also has within it a component of lot level control. So as I said, we're predominantly the reactive force. We're the ones that see it at the end of pipe and try to act on it. I would say too, we have the beaches monitoring program as part of environmental monitoring protection. And what you see on the beach is probably the end of day. Early in the morning, we have groomers out there to clean up the material. But once again, I mean, there's all kinds of signage, there's all kinds of posting. The lifeguards on duty are trying to inform the public to clean up waste and to not bring down disposables in that. But ultimately, we kind of do the cleanup portion of it, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Thank you. I have questions about litter traps for you later, but for now, we'll go on to Caitlin. Do you want to introduce yourself and also answer that question of what does your organization or sector currently do relevant to this issue?
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name is Caitlin Marie Points. I'm the director of our project engineering, energy, and sustainability teams for Unity Health. And we're maybe a little bit different in terms of the fact we do a combination of new construction, but we also do a lot of renovations within our existing facilities. We're constantly repurposing space and moving clinics and around and creating new spaces. So some of the efforts that have been started right now with some of our passionate individuals at the organization. Actually, a lot of them are on the call today with our waste reduction group for our construction renovation team, is that we look at how we can, one, reduce the amount of waste we're producing from those smaller renovations, how we can reuse where possible or recycle if we cannot reuse. So furniture is a big item for us as well. So those are some of the ways that we are looking at trying to reduce our impact on that front. And in terms of the new construction side, I think that's part of, Chelsea, why we reached out and wanted to get engaged with the U of T trash team and all the great work that you've been doing. And hopefully we can collaborate to implement some of these suggested changes to see if that makes an impact, because I think part of doing something is collaborating together and working to build what is the best solution. And sometimes that requires a little bit of elbow grease and research and trial and error just to see what's going to work and not work. So every little step we can take is something that we're looking at.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, and I should mention, so we'll be working with Caitlin on the pilot that Ella mentioned. We didn't put it into the PowerPoint, Caitlin, because we weren't sure if you wanted us to advertise that, but we're really excited to work with you.
Yeah, if you advertise it, then we have to do it.
And you have to do it, yes. Okay, so now we'll turn it over to you, Teresa, to both introduce yourself and then answer that first question, which I can repeat if you would like.
Yeah, no, I got it. I'll introduce myself. So Teresa McGrath with Habitable. I lead the research team here. My background's in chemistry and toxicology, and I've worked in government, in NGOs, in most recently before joining Habitable, worked for a manufacturer with Sherwin-Williams, Valspar Paints and Coatings, and leading their chemicals management program. And so from all of those vantage points, I've been working on green chemistry or pollution prevention strategies. At Habitable, I lead the research team, and we dig into what building materials are made of. What are the so we look at what are the chemicals and materials that go into each of these building materials, and what are the chemicals used during each life cycle stage, during raw material extraction through end of life. And we produce guidance for project teams to select typically safer materials. So we're not a certification organization, but we do give general guidance on product types that are going to be better in terms of the use and release of hazardous chemicals throughout their life cycle. And one of the things that you'll hear at one of the other questions is we talk about how plastic foam in particular tends to be worst in class at every life cycle stage. So we're talking about construction waste and construction pollution and leakage, but pollution happens at all these life cycle stages. And plastic, when you compare it to mineral or wood fiber or plant materials, tends to use and release more hazardous chemicals throughout the life cycle of that product. I'll put a link in the chat to some of our guidance. We have guidance on 17 product categories. Insulation is one of them, and I'll talk more about that later in the panel.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, in listening to all of you, I had the realization I'm going to ask the second question in the other direction, from building the material to using the material to cleaning the material. And I think I'm actually going to go ahead and sort of blur my next question with the one following. And so the question I want to ask, and so Teresa, I'm going to stay on you if that's okay, is what does your organization currently do relevant to the issue, which you sort of started to tell us? And what do you think we should do next in terms of reducing leakage from construction sites? And actually, I don't mind if you also want to take it upstream a little bit in terms of that question.
Yeah. So that's great lead in, because we do look at that full life cycle. So we believe a material isn't healthy unless it's healthy for everyone at all of these life cycle stages. And I mentioned pollution can occur at all of those life cycle stages, and that consistently the worst in class options when you're looking at just insulation are those plastic foam insulation, with XPS and spray foam being particularly worst in class. But all of the foam insulations, including EPS, polyiso, are also kind of lower on our guidance compared to other materials. But the great thing about insulation is that there is lots of other non-plastic foam insulation options that are available that work really great. So mineral-based products such as fiberglass or mineral wool insulation are great options. You might, look for formaldehyde-free options within that category, but there are plenty of options on the market. And with all of the research that we've done over our 25 years as an organization has pointed us to the best insulation products, if you can use them, tend to be plant-based insulation materials. Those tend to be cellulose or wood fiber insulation. So the great thing about those is that they have fewer life cycle impacts, but also during that construction phase, which is what we're talking about today, if wood fiber leaks from that construction site, it's less of a problem because it will degrade naturally in the environment. And the other bonus of plant-based materials, again, if they work for the application, is that they're both best in class from a material health perspective and from an embodied carbon perspective, which is a important sustainability attribute as well. So that's what my takeaway from this is. Generally, we can do some upstream impacts and work with the developers and architects and construction teams to choose different materials that are going to set us up for success and cause less leakage generally. And I'll also say that the Global Plastics Treaty negotiations were just last week, and they failed to come to a conclusion or an agreement. But despite that, we think there's lots of efforts from a policy perspective. We know we can collectively work on policies and procedures to minimize pollution by putting in buying policies at a local government level, or construction waste policies, like some of the solutions that were discussed by Ella earlier. But I think that alternative materials needs to be part of that conversation and needs to be considered as one of the solutions that we should be pursuing.
Okay, I like it. Thinking about it being all connected. So Caitlin, I'm going to go to you next as kind of a consumer and a user of some of those materials and ask you, what do you already do and what do you think we should do to help prevent the leakage from construction?
Yeah, well, I think there's so many different options, and part of the challenge is figuring out like what is the best step you can take. Like even, what Teresa was saying about working with the architects and whatnot, like the project teams for these new constructions early on to identify what materials, because sometimes maybe the more eco-friendly material has a longer lead time, or there might be a different construction method that we need to use with it. So it's really important that all of that gets incorporated in at the front end, so we're not stuck in a situation where we're being forced to purchase or use things that we're not really interested in. And then the other thing that we're doing internally, I mentioned kind of the construction renovations as well, we've built and developed this guideline, sustainability guideline, to try to give the project manager some guidance as to different steps they can take in order to reduce the waste or reduce the energy consumption or impact of their projects. And even on a larger scale, you know, looking at, instead of buying standalone air conditioning units, for example, is there a way to use centralized or renewable resources so that we're not bringing in products that need to be manufactured in several different components, shipped to site, contain refrigerants, as an example, is something that can leak. Another great example, maybe a little bit less related to construction waste specifically, but the hospital has a lot of gas systems. Nitrous oxide is one of those. We have determined that those centralized systems leak this gas into the atmosphere very consistently, and the global warming potential of those is significantly higher than that of carbon dioxide. So we're looking at, you know, from a practice perspective, do we even need to have those gases on hand, or can they be in smaller quantities? Does it need to be a centralized system? So there's a lot of work that can go into the design, as well as like the operational piece of things to determine, you know, we're just so used to saying, okay, we need to have these 5 things as part of the new building or part of the construction, but do we really have to have those things? And even something as simple as like, how do we heat and cool the construction zone during construction, right? Are we using like natural gas? Are we using standalone units? Are there ways that we can be more efficient there, where we're reducing the impact that the construction has? And I suppose the topic I'm actually super interested in and haven't done a ton of time to dive into it yet is the whole concept of circularity of construction materials, because a lot of the time we're building new, but we're demoing old. So what is viable in terms of reuse, you know, understanding that some materials, like from very old wings, might have had hazardous materials included in them, and we want to make sure we're disposing of those properly, first of all, and not reusing those. So there's a lot of complexity that goes into that reuse of materials as well, but definitely something that I'm hoping we can focus a little bit more on as we move forward with some of our larger redevelopment.
Neat. Perfect. Okay. And finally, Gary, over to you. And actually, I'm going to invite everybody to type questions that you have into the chat now, or start to think about them, because we're going to move into the question and answer session after Gary. But Gary, question for you. Now we're moving downstream. What do you think? So what do you do? And I think some of that you answered. And what do you think we should do? And I guess I would say to both prevent, meaning from having it exit the site, and also for cleanup in terms of from a city government perspective.
Well, as I said, from as far as leaving the site, I mean, I think you have to understand that everything here comes to expediency. I'm thinking of large developments predominantly, which I work for. They're working in small footprints, have a limited amount of time. There's contractors, subcontractors, and subcontractors that are working on site. So lot level control is often, or that type of thing that we refer to as lot level control, is usually not high priority to them. And I guess the only option there is to make it high priority to them. It's going to come down to a cost benefit analysis, quite frankly. If we're talking about materials being used on site, then the developer themselves has to be competitive. So nobody wants more government, but I think it would require some type of legislative initiative. Because again, the developers, they wish to get in there fast and get out there fast, and they're going to do it at the lowest common price point as they possibly can. So when we go on site, for instance, and we have to address something, concern we might have as far as the behavior on site or the materials that are being lost off site, whether it's just in the liquid form and sediment control, or whether it's in floatables like this, we have to make it uncomfortable for them. And that uncomfortable usually means money. And once money becomes involved, then action gets taken. And when I say money becomes involved, we maybe have a stop work order, or they have to begin to employ certain practices, or we're back at their doorstep the next day. So from that point of view, I would say there has to be a legislative component to it. For all the goodwill that many developers might have in wishing to do the right thing, they're also beholden to a bank somewhere that's carrying their note until that building is occupied and the condo is registered. As far as the other end of it, I mean, we can continue to do the mitigating effects that we do. I suppose we could hand them, but again, those are resource intensive. operations, cleaning out catch basins, sweeping streets, that type of thing. And still we have the product that we have to dispose of. So it's not that, it's going away. It's just going away in a different way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. I'm going to turn it over to the audience now if anyone has any questions that they want to type into the chat, or you can go ahead and raise your hand. And I think while you're doing that, I'm not sure who this question is for, so any of you can answer. But one thing that's coming, well, there's two things kind of coming to mind as you speak. One, as I'm thinking of the kind of the solutions that Ella put up that we're thinking of piloting, and they really are more around the cleaning up and capturing it while you're doing the actual construction, or the storm traps, the litter traps, which is kind of a cleanup after. We haven't really touched on kind of what Teresa's talking about, which is the thinking about maybe the purchasing and procurement of different items. And I guess I'm thinking in terms of those solutions. Gary, I'll ask you this first, and then unless there's a question, I'll turn it over to Teresa and Caitlin. But I guess in terms of that, the city part, I would think would only really matter. Well, of course, like you said, regulation could happen where you put some things into place. But in terms of cleanup, if we were to do litter traps, for example, in the city of Toronto, and you currently already put up that cloth that goes over it, would there be opportunity to change the drain in some way where, you had that litter trap and that cloth kind of went down into it? So you're both capturing the large stuff, the litter, the foam, in addition to the sediments that you're currently thinking about.
Yeah, I guess the question would come down, as I said, 120,000 catch basins across the city. Who owns these litter traps? I mean, at the moment, we have standard designs for manholes, catch basins, maintenance access covers, things of that nature from the Ontario Building Code and such. So if we were to install something manufactured that doesn't exactly meet code or isn't included in the standard drawings, who owns it? What are the requirements involved, the risks involved, all those other issues? It's always the devil's in the detail. I mean, when we go out to these sites and we see something of that nature, I'm always hesitant to offer a solution. I mean, a filter cloth is safe, easily replaced and maintainable, tried and true and such. I'd be very hesitant from a city employee to say, well, have you looked at litter traps on this site for the duration of your construction? Have you looked at that? Because I'm acting as a consultant at that point, and that might not exactly be my job.
Sure. Yeah. The city of Toronto Water does own 10 of them, but they're on the
Yeah.
water litter, not for construction.
Yeah.
And
the city of Toronto does have swirl separators and some vortex devices and that are piloting, so to speak, or have been successful.
Yeah.
But again, those are purpose built as the waterfront is.
Right. Yeah. Okay, I think I have 2 more minutes, but I do want to ask a quick question to both of you because I am curious. So Teresa, I'm curious if in 1 minute you can answer the question of how much have you seen in terms of companies coming to you for advice and switching the materials that they use, thinking about the end of life?
Yeah, I think when people know about it, know about the impacts, they are much more mindful about the materials that they choose. And you may, so yes, I think it's an education opportunity, and it needs to be as early as possible in project design to be effective and to work. But when you know about it, people make those changes. So we have worked with a number of affordable housing projects, schools, offices around the country, and everyone's able to make a change and move up. And it's not, you don't have to be perfect. You can do reduced plastic use, but any chance to reduce that the worst in class products is going to be a win overall.
Yeah, I like that. You don't have to be perfect. Don't let perfect be the enemy of the good, which is, I think, maybe part of what happened with the international agreement, but definitely not all of it. Caitlin, I'm going to turn it to you for 30 seconds to 1 minute. And I'm just curious, and I'm really excited we're going to get to work with you more. I guess, what do you think is the most feasible thing from an on-site perspective to implement within a site, focusing really on this kind of reducing litter aspect? I know you asked this question in the chat about the litter traps. So.
Yeah, I actually don't know the answer to that question. I don't do enough of the on-site construction myself to be able to actually respond to that. So, um, yeah, I think as you know, I don't know, Chelsea, if you've thought about reaching out to the city in terms of the Toronto Green Standard. I know they're constantly revitalizing that, but there might be some opportunities in there just to even start with something small around the requirements for like there's a lot in there around the new build and it being green and sustainable, but maybe not so much around the actual construction. There's a bit around demolition waste, I think, but that's about it. So maybe
Yeah.
some opportunities there.
Yeah, well, this is why we're excited to work with you. I guess we'll try to figure out what is feasible. So with that, I want to thank the panel. We have one more minute. I'm going to turn it over to Susan to close us out. But thank you so much. And I hope this is the beginning of a conversation. And actually, I think with all three of you, it is, because we've started to work with you a bit, Teresa, and your work. And Gary, we'll keep talking to you as we go through this pilot with Caitlin. So Susan, back over to you. I'm going to share my screen and you can finish this out.
Amazing. So I see we've got our final slide up, which brings us to the end of today's webinar, as well as to the end of our pollution prevention project webinar series. But of course, these projects continue on. And so we encourage you to stay in touch with our group and team. But of course, we'd very much like to thank again our incredible speakers led by our undergraduate researcher, Ella, as well as Gary, Caitlin, and Teresa, who just participated in our panel led by Chelsea. We really thank you for sharing your time and insightful perspectives. We will be sharing a copy of today's webinar once available by email. We have a link to our YouTube with previous recordings from our earlier webinars if you want to, tuck in and watch all 4 of them in a row and learn a lot. We do encourage you to stay in touch with us. You can follow us online with the information on the screen here, and check back on our website for upcoming events. Reach out anytime. And thanks again so much for joining everyone today. Thanks again and take care.